My neighbor called me at work and said, "I don't want to be the person who tells you this, but if you leave right now, you might still catch them." 30 minutes later, I unlocked my front door and walked into a scene that destroyed 15 years of friendship. Mrs. Carter lives 2 doors down from me. She's in her 70s. She grows tomatoes. She waves at me every single morning when I reverse out of the driveway without fail. In 4 years of living on that street, she had never once called my phone. Not once. So when her name showed up on my screen in the middle of that meeting, I figured it was a mistake. Pocket dial, wrong number. Something like that. I declined it. She called again. I declined it again. A little more confused this time. Third call. 3 calls in less than 2 minutes from a woman who had never called me once. I told my manager I needed a second and stepped into the hallway and answered. And the sound of her voice, I can't fully explain it. But you know how. You can tell immediately from someone's voice that whatever they're about to say cost them something. It was that. She said she didn't want to be the one to tell me this. She said if I left right now, I might still catch them. I asked, catch who? She went quiet for a second that felt much longer than a second. And then she said my husband's name. And then she said, my best friend's name. I just stood there in the hallway with the fluorescent light doing that thing where it flickers slightly. And I remember staring at the carpet pattern and thinking, no, that's not right. She's confused. There's an explanation. I drove home in 30 minutes flat, and I have no real memory of the drive. Here's the thing. On the way home, I kept trying to prepare myself. Told myself maybe it looked like something and wasn't. Maybe Mrs. Carter misread a situation. Maybe there was context I didn't have. I was building an escape route in my own head the whole way there, because some part of me already knew and the rest of me wasn't ready. There was no escape route. They were in my living room, James and Chloe, together. Unmistakably, undeniably together. And they weren't panicking. They weren't scrambling. They were just there. And they were laughing, like I'd walked in on them in the middle of a good story and I was the interruption. And on the coffee table open, half empty, the champagne, my champagne, the specific bottle I had saved in the back of the fridge with a little note on it for our anniversary that weekend. That exact bottle, they'd opened it for this. I stood there and I genuinely could not speak. 8 years of marriage, 15 years of friendship with Chloe. And I just stood there in my own doorway holding my bag like an idiot, while my brain tried to catch up to what my eyes were seeing. James looked at me, and do you know what his face did? He looked annoyed. Not caught, not sorry, annoyed. Like I'd interrupted something he was enjoying. And Chloe, my best friend, my maid of honor, the woman who sat with me through 2 miscarriages, Chloe rolled her eyes. A full, actual, deliberate eye roll, and she sighed and said, well, I guess she knows. Not sorry, not ashamed. Just, yeah, okay. Logistical problem. Moving on. James kind of leaned back and went, since you're here, we might as well stop pretending. And that was it. That was the moment. Not a dramatic confession. Not tears. Not even the decency of an apology. Just since you're here. I thought that was the worst of it. I was so wrong. Because once Chloe decided there was no point pretending anymore, she just stopped filtering. And what came out without the filter was genuinely one of the most brutal things anyone has ever said to me, and I've been turning it over in my head. For a year and a half, and I still can't fully absorb it. 5 years. Not a recent thing. Not a slip. Not something that happened and spiraled. 5 deliberate, continuous, chosen years. While she stood next to me in my wedding photos. While she gave a speech at the reception about what real friendship looks like. While she held my hand in waiting rooms. While she told me I was her person. 5 years, and then she smiled and said honestly he was mine first. I just stared at her. She kept going. Said she'd only introduced us because she figured I'd never actually keep him. Let me explain why that one hit the way it did. Chloe introduced me to James. She was the one who said you two should meet at a party, and played matchmaker. And I had believed for 8 years that she did it because she loved me and wanted good things for me. That was the story I carried. That was part of our whole friendship. Turns out the actual story was that she made a bet I would lose him, and when I didn't, she just took him anyway. For 5 years, right there inside my marriage. I don't have a word for what that feels like. I don't think there is one. Okay, so I need you to stay with me here, because this is where it gets from bad to something else entirely. A bit later, once the shock started moving into something colder, I started asking questions, and the answers came in pieces over the next few hours, and each one landed separately like his parents knew. Sat across from me at Christmas dinner every year and smiled and passed the potatoes and knew. Her parents knew, hugged me at my wedding and cried, and told me how much they loved me, and how glad they were Chloe had a friend like me. And they knew. His brother knew. Two of our friends knew. All these people, people who were in my life, my actual life, people I cooked for and traveled with and trusted, they all knew. And every single one of them looked at their own discomfort and decided it outweighed my right to know the truth. That's the part that doesn't get better. The affair eventually becomes a thing that happened. But the knowing, all those people sitting in the knowing and choosing themselves over me, over and over for 5 years, that one I'm still working through. And then, because apparently this day had not yet finished with me, James went to the kitchen drawer and came back with a folder. Divorce papers. Already drawn up, already signed by him, already filed. An attorney he had hired without telling me. He slid them across to me like he was giving me a receipt for something. He said, "Don't make this difficult." And then, I swear to you, he told me he had already promised Chloe the house. Now. I need you to understand what I mean when I say the house. Not a joint property. Not something with both our names on a mortgage. My grandmother's house? A house I inherited before James and I ever went on a single date together. A house with my name only on the deed. A house that had been in my family for decades. He had promised it to her. And Chloe tilted her head and said I'd always been too emotional for a house like this anyway. That someone who actually appreciated it should live there. I want to tell you, I screamed. That I threw something. That I did something appropriately explosive to match the size of what was happening. What actually happened was I went quiet. Really quiet. And I smiled. Not a nice smile. Not a sad one either. Something else. Something that I think confused both of them because they'd been expecting the emotional Sarah they'd always assumed I was, and they got this instead. That smile was the moment everything changed. Because in that moment, I stopped being heartbroken and started being something else. Something much more useful to me. James always thought my thing with finances was boring. Tedious was the word he used. Chloe had a whole bit about it, so on brand for Sarah. Organized to the point of tragedy. They both found it vaguely embarrassing. This thing I had where I handled all the paperwork, and the accounts, and the insurance, and the investments, and the documents, and the business records. They saw it as evidence that I lacked imagination. I was the spreadsheet wife, the responsible one, the one who read the mortgage documents all the way through, while the interesting people went to do something more exciting. What neither of them ever thought to wonder, not once, apparently was what happens when the spreadsheet wife decides to use everything she knows. I knew every account, every policy, every record, every transaction in 8 years of our financial life. I knew where everything was. I knew what was legal. And I was starting to get a very strong feeling, standing in that kitchen with my fake smile, that I also knew what wasn't. I packed one bag, clothes, my laptop, the photo of my grandmother from the hallway, and a folder of financial documents I had actually already been quietly pulling together over the previous weeks because, and this is the honest version, I'd known something was wrong for a while before I let myself fully know it. That's a thing that happens. You know before you know. I wished them both well. I said it like I meant it. I walked out. They celebrated. Moved Chloe in within the week. Started posting photos my living room, my garden, my kitchen with captions that made me feel physically ill, but also, underneath the ill feeling, something that was starting to sharpen into something useful. They thought I was somewhere falling apart. I was in a rented apartment with a forensic accountant and the best divorce attorney I could find. And I was working harder than I had worked at anything in my life. Chloe had a consulting business. I knew about it vaguely. She'd mentioned it a few times over the years, always framed as just some freelance stuff, nothing interesting. I'd never looked closely because why would I? She was my best friend. What it actually was, what it had apparently been for at least 3 years, was a machine. Fake invoices submitted to James's company. Money routed through Chloe's fake consulting operation into accounts that, when you traced them properly, led right back to the two of them. Tax fraud, money laundering, a whole shadow financial life running underneath the visible one, designed specifically to survive a divorce and leave me with as little as possible. They hadn't just been having an affair, they'd been stealing together, planning for a future that was supposed to be built on money I would never be able to touch, because officially it wouldn't exist. I sat with that for one evening, let myself feel the full enormity of it, cried some, honestly, then made 3 copies of everything, gave one to my attorney, one to his employer, one to the authorities. Then I went home and watched television and tried to sleep and didn't entirely succeed, but that was okay. I'd done my part. The first thing to go was his job. The company audited, found what was there to find, and that was it, escorted out of the building. Access revoked, years of professional reputation erased inside a single afternoon, a Tuesday. 3 days later, the accounts froze. His, hers, the company accounts. The hidden ones, all of it locked down while people with actual authority went through the records. Chloe's consulting company, which had never really existed as a real thing, collapsed pretty much immediately. The lifestyle they'd been photographing in my house and posting online just fell apart. Faster than I honestly expected. And the house. I need to tell you about the house. The deed had my name on it. Only my name. The post-nuptial agreement James had signed years before without reading closely, because he found that sort of paperwork tedious. Because he left that kind of thing to boring spreadsheet. Sarah made it completely clear he had no ownership stake in that property. He couldn't legally promise it to anyone. He never had any right to. The eviction came, and I'm going to be honest with you, I was parked across the street. I had a coffee. I sat in my car, and I watched. Chloe screamed. Not metaphorically. An actual scream, in the front garden, in front of the neighbors she'd been performing her wonderful new life for. James blamed her. She blamed him. They stood in my front garden and went at each other with everything they had while the neighbors came outside, one by one, to watch. The same neighbors they'd been bragging to. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. It was more complicated than that. But I'm not going to pretend I didn't feel something. About a week after the eviction, Chloe left. She took what money was still accessible. James's watch collection, his car, his laptop, even his dog. The dog he'd had for 6 years. The dog he'd named and loved and photographed constantly. She left a note. I heard about the note secondhand, from someone James had told in a moment of absolute low-point vulnerability. The note said, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly, "You cheated on your wife for me. What made you think I'd stay loyal to you?" I've thought about that a lot. About how it's almost admirably honest. In the worst possible way. She wasn't wrong. The thing he'd proven himself capable of, she just eventually turned it in a different direction. He never saw it coming. He really should have. Months later, I'd moved back into my house. Repainted. Replaced what needed replacing. Slowly made it feel like mine again. James called. He was unemployed. In debt. Under investigation. Living in a small apartment. Chloe was gone. Most of his friends had quietly drifted away once his name was attached to fraud charges. He cried, said he was sorry, said he'd ruined everything, said he hadn't understood what he had until it was gone. And then he said, "You're the only person who ever truly loved me." I think he meant it, actually, which made it worse in its own way. I thought about the champagne, the eye roll. I guess she knows. The divorce papers slid across the counter like a receipt. The 5 years. All the people who sat at my dinner table and said nothing. I said, "You're right, I was. That's why losing me cost you everything." And I hung up.